Mrs. Muriel, or Muriel, by Ann Petry, read by Richard M. Thompson, aka Ion Dreams. Mrs. Muriel. Almost every day, Ruth Davis and I walk home from school together. We walk very slowly because we like to talk to each other, and we don't get much chance in school or after school either. We are very much alike. We are both 12 years old, and we are freshmen in high school, and we never study. Well, not very much because we learn faster than the rest of the class. We laugh about the same things, and we are curious about the same things. We even wear our hair in the same style, thick braids halfway down our backs. We are not alike in one respect. She is white, and I am black. Yesterday, when we reached the building that houses my father's drugstore, we sat down on the front steps, long wooden steps that go all the way across the front of the building. Ruth said, "I wish I lived here," and patted the steps, though they were very splintery. Aunt Sophronia must have heard our voices because she came to the door and said, "I left my shoes at the shoemaker's this morning. Please go and get them for me." And she handed me a little cardboard ticket with a number on it. "You want to go with me, Ruth?" "I've got to go home. I'm sure my aunt will have things for me to do just like your aunt." She smiled at Aunt Sophronia. I walked part way home with Ruth and then turned back and went up Petticoat Lane toward the shoemaker's shop. Mr. Bennish, the shoemaker, is a little white man with gray hair. He has a glass eye. His eye is not the same color as his own eye. It is deeper gray. If I stand too close to him, I get a squeamish feeling because one eye moves in its socket and the other eye does not. Mr. Bennish and I are friends. I'm always talking shoes to his shop and taking shoes to his shop to be repaired. We do not own a horse and buggy, and so we walk a great deal. In fact, there is a family rule that we must walk any distance under 3 miles. As a result, our shoes are in constant need of repair. The soles and heels have to be replaced, and we always seem to be in need of shoelaces. Quite often I snag the uppers on the bull briars in the woods, and then the tiers have to be stitched. When I went to get Aunt Sophronia's shoes, Mr. Bennish was sitting near the window. It is a big window, and he has a very nice view of the street. He had on his leather apron and his eyeglasses. His glasses are small, and they have steel rims. He was sewing a shoe, and he had a long length of waxed linen thread in his needle. He waxes the thread himself. I handed him the ticket and got up from his workbench to get the shoes. I saw that he had separated them from the other shoes. These are Aunt Sophronia's store shoes. They had been polished so that they shone like patent leather. They lay alone near the front of the table where he keeps the shoes he has repaired. He leaned toward me, and I moved away from him. I did not like being so close to his eye, his glass eye. "The lady who brought these shoes in, who is she?" I looked at him and raised one eyebrow. It has taken me 2 months of constant practice in front of a mirror to master the art of lifting one eyebrow. Mr. Bennish said, "What's the matter with you? Didn't you hear what I said? Who is the lady who brought these shoes in?" I moved further away from him. He didn't know it, but I was imitating Doddle Smith, my favorite person in the world. Doddle tells the most wonderful stories, and he can act and recite poetry. He visits our family every summer. Anyway, I bowed to Mr. Bennish, and I bowed to an imaginary group of people seated somewhere on my right, and I said, "Gentlemen, be seated. Mr. Bones, who was that lady I saw you with last night?" I lowered the pitch of my voice and said, "That was no lady, that was my wife." "Girlie." "Why do you keep calling me girlie? I have a name." "I cannot remember people's names. I'm too old. I've told you that before." "How old are you, Mr. Bennish?" "None of your business," he said pettishly. "Who?" "Well, I only asked in order to decide whether to agree with you that you're old enough to be forgetful. Does the past seem more real to you than the present?" Mr. Bennish scowled in his annoyance. "The town is full of children," he said, It's the children who bring the shoes in and come and get them after I've fixed them. They run the errands. All those children look just alike to me. I can't remember their names. I don't even try. I don't plan to clutter up my mind with a lot of children's names. I don't see the same children that often, so I call the boys boys and I call the girls girly. I've told you this before. What's the matter with you today? It's spring and the church stream is filled with robins looking for worms. Don't you sometimes wish you were a robin looking for a worm? He sighed. Now tell me, who was that lady that brought in these shoes? My Aunt Sophronia. Sophronia? He said. What a funny name. And she's your aunt? Yes. Does she live with you? Mr. Bennish's cat meowed at the door and I let her in. She's a very handsome creature, gray with white feet and really lovely fur. May-a-ling, may-a-ling, I said, patting her. Where have you been? I always have the feeling that if I wait, if I persist, she will answer me. She is a very intelligent cat and very responsive. Does your aunt live with you? Yes. Has she been living with you very long? About 6 months, I guess. She's a druggist. You mean she knows about medicine? Yes, just like my father. They run a drugstore. Mr. Bennish thrust his hands in Aunt Sophronia's shoes and held them up, studying them. Then he made the shoes walk along the edge of the table in a mimicking kind of walk, a caricature of the way a woman walks. She has small feet, hasn't she? No. I tried to sound like my mother when she disapproves of something. He flushed and wrapped the shoes in newspaper, making a very neat bundle. Is she married? Who, Aunt Sophronia? No, she's not married. Mr. Bennish took his cookie crock off the shelf. He lives in the shop. Against one wall, he has a kitchen stove, a big black iron stove with nickel fenders and a tea kettle on it, and there is a black iron sink with a pump right near the stove. He cooks his meals himself, he bakes bread, and usually there is a stew bubbling in a pot on the stove. In winter, the windows of his little shop frost over, so that I cannot see in and he cannot see out. He draws his red curtains just after dusk and lights his lamps, and the windows look pink because of the frost and the red curtains and the lights shining from behind them. Sometimes he forgets to draw the curtains that separate his sleeping quarters from the rest of the shop, and I can see his bed. It is a brass bed. He evidently polishes it because it shines like gold. It has a very intricate design on the headboard and the footboard. He has a little piece of flowered carpet in front of his bed. I can see his white china pot under the bed. A dark suit and some shirts hang on hooks on the wall. There is a chest of drawers with a small mirror and a gold frame over it, and a wash bowl and pitcher on a wash stand. The wash bowl and pitcher are white with pink rosebuds painted on them. Mr. Bennish offered me a cookie from the big stoneware crock. Have a cookie, girlie. He makes a big, thick molasses cookie. I ate 3 of them without stopping. I was hungry and didn't know it. I ate the 4th cookie very slowly, and I talked to Mr. Bennish as I ate it. I don't think my Aunt Sophronia will ever get married. Why not? Well, I never heard of a lady druggist before, and I don't know who a lady druggist would marry. Would she marry another druggist? There aren't any around here anywhere except my father, and certainly she couldn't marry him. He's already married to my mother. She looks like a gypsy, Mr. Bennish said dreamily. You mean my Aunt Sophronia? Mr. Bennish nodded. She does not. She looks like my mother and my Aunt Ellen. And my father and Uncle Janyo say they look like Egyptian queens. They are not very tall, and they move quickly, and their skins are brown and very smooth, and their eyes are big and black, and they stand up very straight. They are not alike, though. My mother is a business-minded woman. She likes to buy and sell things. She is a chopodist, chiprodist, it's a new word, and a hairdresser. Life sometimes seems full of other people's hair and their toenails. She makes a hair tonic and sells it to her customers. She designs luncheon sets and banquet cloths and guest towels and sells them. Aunt Ellen and Uncle Johnyo provide culture. Uncle Ellen lectures at schools and colleges. She plays Bach and Beethoven on the piano and organ. She writes articles for newspapers and magazines. I do not know very much about Aunt Sophronia. She works in the drugstore. She fills prescriptions. She does embroidery. She reads a lot. She doesn't play the piano. She's very neat. The men who come in the store look at her out of the corner of their eyes. Even though she wears her hair skin tight back from her forehead and wears very plain clothes, dresses with long, tight sleeves and high necks, but still looks like, well, like an Egyptian queen. She is young but seems very quiet and sober. Mr. Bennish offered me another cookie. I'll eat it on my way home to get my strength up. Thank you very much, I said primly. When I gave the shoes to Aunt Sophronia, I said, Mr. Bennish thinks you look like a gypsy. My mother frowned. Did he tell you to repeat that? No, he didn't, but I thought it was an interesting statement. I wish you wouldn't repeat things you hear. It just causes trouble. Now, every time I look at Mr. Bennish, I'll wonder about him. What will you wonder? She said I must go and practice my music lesson and ignored my question. I wonder how old I will be before I can ask questions of an adult and receive honest answers. My family always finds something for me to do. Are they not using their power as adults to give orders in order to evade the questions? That event, about 5 o'clock, Mr. Bennish came in the door that same evening, and I was sitting on the bench in the front. It is a very cold bench. The customers sit there while they wait for their prescriptions to be filled. The wood is a beautiful color. It is a deep reddish brown. Mr. Bennish sat down beside me on the bench. His presence irritated me. He kept moving his hands up and down the arms of a bench and up and down in a quick, nervous movement. It is as though he thought he had an awl in his hand, and he was going in and out, making holes in leather and sewing, slipping a needle in and out, as he would mend a saddle or a pair of boots. My father looked at him over the top of his glasses and said, Well, Bennish, what can I do for you? Nothing. Nothing at all. I just stopped in to pass the time of day to see how you all were. His voice trailed away softly. He comes every evening. I find this very annoying. Quite often I have to squeeze myself onto the bench. Pritchett, the sexton of the Congregational Church, stout, red-faced, smelling of whiskey, rings the bell for a service at 7 o'clock, and then he, too, sits in the front of the store watching the customers as they go until closing time. He eyed Mr. Bennish rather doubtfully at first, but then ignored him. When the sexton and Mr. Bennish were on the bench, there was just enough room for me to squeeze in between them. I didn't especially mind the sexton, but he usually went to sleep, nodding and dozing until it was time to close the store. But Mr. Bennish doesn't sit still, and the movement of his hands is distracting. My mother finally spoke to my father about Mr. Bennish. They were standing in the back room. Why does Mr. Bennish sit out there in the store so much? She asked. Nothing else to do. She shook her head. I think he's interested in Sophronia. He keeps looking around for something, for someone. My father laughed out loud. That dried up old white man? The laughter of my father is a wonderful sound. If you know anything about music, you know he sings tenor, and you know he sings in the Italian fashion with an open throat, and You begin to smile, and if he laughs long enough, you laugh too, because you cannot help it. Bennish, he said, and he laughed so hard that he had to lean against the door jamb in order to keep his balance. Every night, right after supper, Mr. Bennish sits in the store rubbing his arm of the bench with that quick jerking motion of his hand, nodding to people who come in, sometimes talking to them, but mostly just sitting. 2 weeks later, I walked past his shop. He came to the door and called me. Girlie, he said, beckoning. Yes, Mr. Bennish? Is your aunt with the peculiar name still here? That is, in town, living with you? Yes, she is, Mr. Bennish. Does she ever go in the drugstore? Not after 5 o'clock, Mr. Bennish. My father doesn't approve of ladies working at night. At night, we act just like other people's families. We sit around the table in the dining room and talk. We play checkers and we read and we, yes, yes, he said impatiently. But don't your aunt ever go anywhere at night? I don't think so. I go to bed early. Do you think? And he shook his head. Never mind, girlie, never mind. And he sighed. Here, I just made up a fresh batch of those big cookies you like so well. I walked down Petticoat Lane toward the drugstore, eating one of Mr. Bennish's thick molasses cookies. I wished I had taken time to tell him how cozy our downstairs parlor is in the winter. We have turkey red curtains at the windows too, and we pull the window shades and draw the curtains, and there is a very thick rug on the floor, and it is a small room, so the rug completely covers the floor. The piano is in there, and an old-fashioned sofa with a carved mahogany frame and a very handsome round stove. And it is warm in the winter. And in the summer, when the windows are open, you can look right out into the backyard and smell the flowers and feel the cool air that comes from the garden. The next afternoon, Mr. Bennish came in the drugstore about 3:15. It was a cold, windy afternoon. I had just come from school, and there was a big mug of hot cocoa for me. Aunt Sophronia had it ready and waited for me in the back room. I had just tasted the first spoonful. It was much too hot to gulp down. I leaned way over and blew on it gently and inhaled the rich, chocolatey smell of it. I heard my aunt say, Why, Mr. Bennish, what are you doing now at this hour? I thought I'd like an ice cream soda. Mr. Bennish's voice sounded breathless, lighter in weight, and the pitch was lower than normal. I peeked out at him. He was sitting near the fountain in one of the ice cream parlor chairs. He looked very stiff and prim and neater than usual. He seemed to have flattened his hair closer to his skull. This made his head appear smaller. He was holding his head a little to one side. He looked like a bird, but I cannot decide what bird, perhaps a chickadee. He drank the soda neatly and daintily. He kept looking at Aunt Sophronia. He comes every day now, in the middle of the afternoon. He should have been in his shop, busily repairing shoes or making boots or making stews and cookies. Instead, he is in our store, and his eyes, like gray eye, the one good eye, travels busily over Aunt Sophronia. His ears seem to waggle when he hears her voice, and he has taken to giggling in a very silly fashion. He always arrives about the same time. Sometimes I sit in one of the ice cream parlor chairs and talk to him. He smells faintly of leather and of shoe polish and of wax and of dead flowers. It was quite a while before I could place that other smell, dead flowers. Each day, he stays a little longer than he stayed the day before. I have noticed that my father narrows his eyes a little when he looks at Mr. Bennish. I heard him say to my mother, I don't like it. I don't want to tell him not to come in here, but I don't like it. An old white man in here every afternoon looking at Sophronia and licking his chops. Well, I just don't like it. Aunt Sophronia took a sudden interest in the garden. In the afternoon, after school, I help her set out plants and sow seed. Our yard is filled with gardens with flowers in the summer, and we have a vegetable garden that, in some ways, is as beautiful as the flowers. It is so neat and precise looking. We keep chickens so that we can have fresh eggs, and we raise a pig and have him butchered in the fall. When the weather is bad and we cannot work in the garden, Aunt Sophronia and I clean house. I do not like to clean house, but I do like to sort out the contents of other people's bureau drawers. We started setting Aunt Sophronia's bureau in order. She showed me a picture of her graduating class from Pharmacy College. She was the only girl in a class of boys. She was black and the boys were white. I did not say anything about the difference in color, and neither did she, but I did try to find out what it was like to be the only member of the female sex in a class filled with males. Didn't you feel funny with all those boys? They were nice, very nice boys. Oh, I'm sure they were, but didn't you feel very funny being the only girl with so many young men? No, I never let them get overly friendly, and we got along very well. I looked at the picture and then I looked at her and said, "You are beautiful." She put the picture back in her top drawer. She keeps her treasures in there. She has a collar made of real lace and a pair of very long white kid gloves and a necklace made of gold nuggets from Colorado that a friend of my mother's left to Aunt Sophronia in her will. The gloves and the collar smell like our garden in August when the flowers are in full bloom and the sun is shining on them. Sometimes I forget that Aunt Sophronia is an adult and that she belongs to the enemy camp, and I make the mistake of saying what I have been thinking. I leaned against the bureau and looked down into the drawer and at the picture and said, "You know, this picture reminds me of the night last summer when there was a female moth, one of those huge night moths, on the inside of the screen door, and all the male moths for miles around came and clung on the outside of the screen, making their wings flutter, and, you know, they didn't make any sound, but it was kind of scary. Weren't you?" Aunt Sophronia closed the drawer with a hard push. "You get a broom and a dustpan, and we'll begin to sweep in the hall," she said. On Saturday morning, after I finished washing the breakfast dishes and scrubbing the kitchen floor, I paid a call on Mr. Bennish. He was cleaning his house, too. He had taken down the red curtains that hung at the windows all winter, and the red curtains that hung in the front of his bed, separating his sleeping quarters from the rest of his shop. And he was washing these curtains in a big tub at the side of his house. He was making a terrific splashing, and the soap suds were pale pink. He had his sleeves rolled up. His arms are very white and stringy looking. "Too much red for summer, girlie. I've got to get out of the green summer ones. Yeah, I gotta get out the green summer ones." He hung them on the line and poured the wash water out on the ground. It was pink. "Your curtains ran, didn't they?" I looked at a little pink puddle left on top of a stone. "If you keep washing them, they'll be pink instead of red." His own eye, the real one, moved away from me, and there was something secret and rather sly about his expression. He said, "I haven't seen your aunt in the store lately. Where is she?" "She's been busy fixing the garden and cleaning the house. Everybody seems to be cleaning house. As soon as I get my green curtains put up, I'm going to ask your aunt to come have tea. Where would she have tea with you? In my shop. I shook my head. Aunt Sophronia doesn't drink tea in people's bedrooms, and you have only that one room for your shop, and there's a bed in it, and it would be just like, I would like to have her look at some old jewelry that I have, and I thought she might have tea. Mr. Bennish, I said, do you like my Aunt Sophronia? Now, girlie, he said, and he tittered. Well, now, do you think your aunt likes me? Not especially, not any more than anybody else. I think you're too old for her, and besides, well, you're white, and I don't think she would be very much interested in an old white man. Do you? He frowned and said, you go home. You're very rude, girl. You asked me what I thought, Mr. Bennish. I don't see why you get mad when I tell you what I think. You did ask me, Mr. Bennish. I followed him inside his shop. He settled himself near the window and started to work on a man's boot. It needed a new sole, and he cut the sole out of leather. I looked out the front window. There is always enough breeze to make his sign move back and forth. It makes a sighing noise. In the winter, if there's a wind, the sign seems to groan because it moves back and forth quickly. There is a high-laced shoe painted on the sign. The shoe must once have been a deep dark red, but it has weathered to a soft rose color. Mr. Bennish is my friend, and I wanted to indicate that I am still fond of him, though I disapprove of his interest in Aunt Sophronia. I searched for some topic that would indicate that I enjoy talking to him. I said, why don't you have a picture of a man's boot on your sign? I prefer ladies' shoes, more delicate, more graceful. He made an airy gesture with his awl and simpered. I went home and told Aunt Sophronia that Mr. Bennish is going to ask her to have tea with him. Will you go? Of course not, she said impatiently. Aunt Sophronia did not have tea with Mr. Bennish. He sees her so rarely in the store that he finally came in search of her. It is summer now, and the Wheeling Inn is open for the season. The great houses along the waterfront are occupied by their rich owners. We are all very busy. At night, after the stores close, we sit in the backyard. On those warm June nights, the fireflies come out, and there is a kind of soft summer light, composed of moonlight and starlight. The grass is thick underfoot, and the air is sweet. Almost every night, my mother and my father and Aunt Sophronia and I, and sometimes Aunt Ellen and Uncle Junio, sit there in the quiet and in the sweetness and in that curious soft light. Last night, when we were sitting there, Mr. Bennish came around the side of the house. There was something tentative in the way he came toward us. I had been lying on the grass, and I sat up straight, wondering what they would do and what they would say. He sidled across the lawn. He didn't speak until he was practically upon us. My mother was sitting in the hammock under the cherry tree, rocking gently back and forth, and she didn't see him until he spoke. He said, "Good evening." He sounded as though he was asking a question. We all looked at him. I hoped that someone would say, "What are you doing in our backyard, our private place, our especially private place? You are an intruder. Go back to your wax thread and your awl. Go back to your house and your cat." Nobody said anything. We stood there for a while, waiting, hesitant, and then he bowed and sat down, cross-legged, on the grass near Aunt Sophronia. He was sitting on one of the benches, and he sat so close to her that her skirt was resting on one of his trouser legs. I kept watching him. One of his hands reached toward her skirt, and he gently fingered the fabric. Either she felt this or the motion attracted her attention because she moved away from him and gathered her skirt about, and then stood up and said, "The air is making me sleepy. Good night." The next afternoon, I took a pair of my father's shoes to Mr. Bennish to have the heels fixed. My father wears high-laced black boots. I left them on Mr. Bennish's work table. "You can get them tomorrow." I did not look right at him. I leaned over and patted Muriel. "She has such a lovely name, Mr. Bennish. It seems to me a name especially suited for a cat." Mr. Bennish looked at me over the top of his little steel-rimmed glasses. "You've got a nice backyard," he said. "I don't think you should have been in it." "Why not?" he asked sharply. "Did anybody say that I shouldn't have been in it?" "No, but the front part of the building, the part where the drugstore is, belongs to everybody. The back part of the building and upstairs in the building and the yard are ours. The yard is a private part of our lives. You don't belong in it. You're not a part of our family. But I like to be a part of your family. You can't get to be a part of other people's families. You have to be born into a family. The family part of our lives is just for us. Besides, you don't seem to understand that you are the wrong color, Mr. Bennish." He didn't answer this. He got up and got his cookie crock and silently offered me a cookie. After I returned from the shoe shop, I sat on the wooden steps that run across the front of the drugstore. I was trying to decide how I really feel about Mr. Bennish. I always sit at the far end of the steps with my back against a tight board fence. It was a very good place from which to observe the street, the front of the store, the church green. People walk past me not noticing that I'm there. Sometimes their conversations are very unusual. I can see a long way down the path that bisects the green. It is a dirt path and not too straight. The only straight paths in town are those in front of the homes of people who have gardeners. From where I sat, I could see a man approaching. He was strolling down the path that crosses the church green. This is a most unusual way for a man to walk in Wheeling in the summer. It is during the summer that the year-round residents earn their living. They mow lawns and cut hedges, the weed gardens, and generally look after the summer people. Able-bodied men in Wheeling walked faster in summer. This tall, broad-shouldered man was strolling down the path. He was wearing a white suit, the pants quite tight in the leg, and he had his hands in his hip pockets, and a stiff straw hat, a boater on the back of his head. I sat up very straight when I discovered that this was a very dark-colored man. I could not imagine where he came from. He could not possibly have been a butler or a waiter, even if he had wanted to and spent a whole lifetime in trying. He would never have been able to walk properly. He would always swagger, and who ever heard of a swaggering butler or a waiter who strolled around a table? As he came nearer, I saw that he had a beard, an untidy, shaggy beard, like the beard of a goat. His hair was long and shaggy and rough-looking too, though he was tall with wide shoulders. Thick, rough hair on his head and the goat's beard made his head and face look too big, out of proportion to his body. When he saw me, he came straight toward me. He bent over me, smiling, and I moved back away from him, pressing against the fence. His eyes alarmed me. Whenever I think about his eyes, I close mine, trying to shut his out. They are reddish brown, and they look hot, and and having looked into them, I cannot seem to look away. I have never seen anyone with eyes that color or with that strange quality, whatever it is. I describe them as looking hot, but that's not possible. It must be that they are the color of something that I associate with fire or heat. I don't know what it is. You lost? He said. No, are you? Yup. All us black folks is lost. He said this in a husky, unmusical voice and turned away and went into the store. I went in the store too. If this unusual looking man with the goat's beard got into a discussion of all us black folks is lost with my father, I wanted to hear it. My father said, "Howdy do?" And he made it a question. The bearded man nodded and said, "The druggist, Dion?" "I'm the druggist." "This your store?" "That's right." "Nice place you got here." "You been here long?" My father grunted. I waited for him to make the next move in the game we called Stanley and Livingstone. All black strangers who came into our store were Livingstones, and it was up to the members of our family to find out which lost Mr. Livingstone or which lost Mrs. Livingstone we had encountered in the wilds of the all-white town of Wheeling. When you live in a town where there aren't any other black people, naturally you're curious when another black person shows up. I sat down in the front of the store and waited for my father to find out which Mr. David Livingstone he was talking to and what he was doing in our town. But my father looked at him with no expression on his face and said, "And what did you want?" The man with the goat's beard fished in the pocket of his tight white pants. In order to do this, he thrusted his leg forward a little to ease the strain on the fabric, and thus he gave the impression that he was pawing the ground. He handed my father a piece of paper. "I got a prescription for lotion." "It'll take a few minutes," my father said, and went in the back room. The bearded man came and sat beside me. "Do you live here in Wheeling?" I asked. "I work at the inn. I'm the piano player." "You play the piano?" "And I sing. I'm the whole orchestra. I play for the dinner hour. I play for all those nice, rich white folks to dance at night. I'll be here all summer." "You will?" "That's right. And I've never seen a deader town." "What's your name?" "Chink." "Mr. Chink." "No," he said, and stood up. "Chink is my first name. Chink Johnson." Mr. Johnson is a restless kind of man. He keeps moving around when he is sitting still, moving his feet, his hands, his head. He crosses his legs, uncrosses them, clasps his hands together, unclasps them. "Why are you having a prescription filled?" "Hand lotion. I use it for my hands." My father came out of the back room, wrapped up a bottle, and said, "Here you are." Chink Johnson paid him and said goodbye to me, and I said, "Goodbye, Chink." "What's his name?" "Chink Johnson. He plays the piano at the inn." Chink Johnson seems to me a very interesting and unusual man. To my surprise, my father did not mention our newest Mr. Livingstone to the family. He said nothing about him at all. Neither did I. Yet, he comes in the drugstore fairly often. He buys cigarettes and throat lozenges. Sometimes he buys cough medicine. Sometimes he drives over from the inn in a borrowed horse and carriage. Sometimes he walks over. My father has a very little to say to him. He does not linger in the store because my father's manner is designed to discourage him from lingering or hanging around, but he does seem to be looking for something. He looks past the door of the prescription room, and on hot afternoons, the door in the very back is open, and you can see our yard with its beautiful little flower gardens. And he looks out into the yard, seems to search it. When he leaves, he looks at the house, examining it. It is as though he's trying to see around the corner, see through the walls, because some sixth sense has told him that there exists on the premises something that will interest him. If he looks hard enough, he will find it. My mother finally caught a glimpse of him as he went out the front door. She saw what I saw, the goat's beard and silhouette, the forward thrust of his head, the thick shaggy hair, because we were standing in the prescription room looking toward the door. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice sharp. "That's the piano player at the inn," my father said. "You never mentioned him. What's his name?" "Jones," my father said. I started to correct him, but I was afraid to interrupt him because he started talking fast in a very loud voice. "Lightfoot Jones," he said. "Shake Jones, Barrel Jones." He started tapping on the glass case in front of him. I've never heard of him or heard him do this before. He sings in a congregational church choir. He has a pure lyrical tenor voice. And he sings all the tenor solos, the sanctus, the heavens are telling. You can tell from his speaking voice that he sings. He is always humming or singing or whistling. And there he was with a pencil in his hand, tapping out a most peculiar rhythm on the glass of a showcase. "Shake Jones," he repeated. "Rhythm in his feet, rhythm in his blood, rhythm in his feet, rhythm in his blood. Beats out his life, beats out his lungs, beat out his liver on a piano." And he began a different and louder rhythm with his foot. "On a piano, on a piano, on a p." "Samuel, what's the matter with you? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about trembling Shakefoot Jones, the piano player who can sit still and comes in here looking round and all around, prancing and stamping his hoofs and sniffing the air, just like a stallion who smells a mare, a stallion who—" "Samuel, how can you talk that way in front of this child?" My father was silent. I said, "His name is Chink Johnson." My father roared, terrible in his anger. "His name is Duke. His name is Bubba. His name is Count. Is Maharaja. Is King of Lions. I don't give a good goddamn what he calls himself. I don't want him and his restless feet hanging round. He can let his long feet slap somebody else's floor, but not mine, not here." He glared at me and glared at my mother. His fury silenced us. At that moment, his eyes were red-brown, just like Chink Johnson. He is shorter. He has no beard, but he had, at that moment, a strong resemblance to Chink. I added to this fury. I said, "You look just like Chink Johnson." He said, "Ah!" He was so angry I could not understand one word he said. I went out the front door and across the street and sat on the church steps and watched the world go by and listened to the faint hum it made as it went round and around. I saw Mr. Bennish go into the drugstore. He stayed a long time. That gave me a certain pleasure because I knew he had come to eat his ice cream soda, mouthful by mouthful, from one of our long-handled ice cream soda spoons, and to look at Aunt Sophronia as he nibbled at the ice cream. He always looks at her out of the corner of his eye, stealing sly glances at her. I knew that Aunt Sophronia would not be in the store until much later and that he was wasting his time. It was my father's birthday, and Aunt Sophronia was in the kitchen baking a great big cake for him. If Mr. Bennish had known this, he might have dropped in on the birthday celebration, even though he hadn't been invited. After all, he had sided into our backyard without being invited. And our yard is completely enclosed by a tight board fence, and there is a gate that you have to open to get in the yard, so that entering our yard is like walking into our living room. It is a very private place. Mr. Bennish is the only person that I know of who has come into our yard without being invited, and he keeps coming, too. After Mr. Bennish left the store, I crossed the street and sat outside on the store steps. It was hot. It was very quiet. Old Lady Chimble crossed the church green carrying a black silk umbrella, and she opened it and used it as a sunshade. A boy went by on a bicycle. Frances Jackins. We called her Aunt Frank. The black cook in the boarding house across the street arrived carrying something in a basket. She is always cross and usually drunk. She drinks gin. My mother says that it was what has made Aunt Frank's lips look as though they were turned inside out. And she says that this is called a gin lip. They are bright red, almost like a red gash across the dark skin of her face. I want very much to ask Aunt Frank about this, how it feels when it happened, etc. And someday I will, but I have not as yet had a suitable opportunity. When she is drunk, she cannot give a sensible answer to a sensible question, and when she's sober, or partially sober, she is very irritable and constantly finds fault with me. She has absolutely no relation to us. It is just that my mother got in the habit of calling her Aunt Frank many years ago, and so we all call her that. Because I'm young, she tries to boss me and to order me around, and she calls me Miss in a very unpleasant, sarcastic way. She is a very good cook when she's sober. But when she is drunk, she burns everything, and she is always staggering across the street and stumbling up our back steps with bread pans filled with dough, which would not rise because she had forgotten the yeast, and with burned cakes and pies and burned hams and roasts of beef. When she burns things, they are not just scorched, they are blackened and hardened until they are like charcoal. Almost every night she scratches at our back door. I have sharper hearing than anybody else. I can hear people walking around the side of our house when no one else has heard them. Anyway, I always hear her first. I open the door suddenly and very fast, and she almost falls into the kitchen and stands there swaying and fouling our kitchen with the sweetest smell of gin and the dank and musty odor of her clothes. She always has a dip of snuff under her lip, her upper lip, and she talks around this obstruction so that her voice is peculiar. She speaks quickly to keep the snuff in place, and sometimes she pauses and works her upper lip, obviously getting the snuff in some special spot. When she comes to the back door at night, she puts the basket of ruined food just inside the door, on the floor, and says to my mother, "Here, Martha, throw this away. Throw it away from me. Give it to the hens. Feed it to the pig." She turns all two-syllable words into two separate one-syllable words. She doesn't say Martha all in one piece. She separates it so that it becomes Martha. She doesn't say away, but a way. It is a very jerky kind of speech. I'm always given the job of burying the stuff in the backyard, way down in the back. I dig a hole and throw the blackened mess into it, and then cover it with lime to hasten decomposition and discourage skunks and dogs. Sometimes I hide behind the fence and yell at her on her way back across the street. "Oh, Aunt Frankie, black as tar, tried to get to heaven in an electric car. car got stalled in an underpass, threw Aunt Frankie right on her ass. Whenever I sing song this rhyme at her, she is invariably tries to climb over the fence, a furious drunken old woman, threateningly with the man's umbrella that she carries. I should think she would remember from past performances that she cannot possibly reach me, but she always tries, after several futile efforts. She gives up and goes back to the boarding house across the street. A lot of old maids and widows live there. No gentlemen, just ladies. They spend their spare time rocking on the front porch and playing whist and looking over at the drugstore. Aunt Frankie spends her spare time in the kitchen of the boarding house, rocking and emptying bottle after bottle of gin. But on the day of my father's birthday, she was sober, at least. She walked as though she were. She had a basket on her arm with a white napkin covering its contents. I decided she must have made something special for my father's supper, yes. She went in the drugstore, and when she came out, she didn't have the basket. She saw me sitting on the steps, but she ignored me. When Sophronia came and stood in the window, she had watched the glass globes that we kept that we keep filled with blue, red, and yellow liquid. She was wearing a dark skirt and a white blouse. Her head and hair was no longer skin tight back from her forehead. It was curling around her forehead, perhaps because she had been working in the garden, bending over, and the hairpins that usually hold it so tightly in place had worked themselves loose. She didn't look real. The sun was shining in the window, and it reflected the lights from the jars of colored water back on her face and her figure. And she looked golden and rose colored and lavender, and it was as though there were a rainbow moving in the window. Chink Johnson drove up in his borrowed horse and carriage. He stood and talked to me and then started to go in the store. Saw Aunt Sophronia and stood still. He took a deep breath. I could hear him. He took off the stiff straw hat that he wore way back on his head and bowed to her. She noticed and nodded as though she really didn't want to, and turned away and acted as though she were very busy. He grabbed my arm and actually pinched it. "What are you doing?" I said angrily. "What is the matter with you? Let go of my arm." "Shut up," he said impatiently, pinching harder. His fingers felt as though they were made of iron. "Who is that?" I pried his fingers loose and rubbed my arm. "Where?" "In the window." "Who was that girl in the window?" "That's my Aunt Sophronia." "Your aunt?" "Your aunt." "Yes." He went into the store. One moment he was standing beside me, and the next moment he had practically leaped inside the store. I went in too. He was leaning in the window, saying, "Wouldn't you like to go for a walk with me this Sunday?" She shook her head. "Well, couldn't you go for a ride with me? I'll call for you." Aunt Sophronia said, "I work every day." "Every day," he said. "But that's not possible. Nobody works every day. I'll be back tomorrow." And he was gone. Aunt Sophronia looked startled. She didn't look angry, just sort of surprised. I said, "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow." And I thought, well, she's got two suitors now. There's this Shake Jones Livingstone, otherwise known as Chink Johnson, and there's Mr. Bennish. I don't think I would pick either one. Mr. Bennish is too old, even though he is my friend. I think of Chink Johnson as my friend too, but I don't think he would make a good husband. I tried to decide why I didn't approve of him as a husband for Aunt Sophronia. I think it's because Aunt Sophronia is a lady and Chink Johnson is, well, he's not a gentleman. That night at supper, we celebrated my father's birthday. At that hour, nobody much came in the store. Pickett the Saxton sat on the bench in the front, and if anybody came in and wanted my father, he'd come to the back door and holler for him. There was a white tablecloth on the big oak dining room table, and we used my mother's best Haviland china and the sterling silver knives and forks with the rose pattern, and there was a pile of packages by my father's plate, and there were candles on the cake, and we had ice cream for dessert. My old enemy, Aunt Frank, had delivered Parker house rolls for his birthday and had made him a milk pan full of rice pudding because my father has always said that when he dies he hopes it will be because he drowns in a sea composed of rice pudding, that he could eat rice pudding morning, noon, and night. Aunt Frank must have been sober when she made the pudding, for it was creamy and delicious, and I ate 2 helpings of it, right along with my ice cream. I kept waiting for Aunt Sophronia to say something about Chink Johnson. He is a very unusual looking man, and we've never had a customer, black or white, with that kind of beard. She didn't mention him, neither did I. My father has never mentioned him, at least not at the table. I wonder if my father hopes he will vanish. Perhaps they are afraid he will become a part of the family circle if they mentioned him. Now, Chink Johnson has become a part of the family circle, and he used the same method that Mr. Bennish used. He just walked into the yard and into the house. I was upstairs and I happened to look out of the window, and there was Chink Johnson walking up the street. He opened our gate, walked around the side of the house and into our backyard. I hurried to the back of the house and looked out of the window and saw him open the screen door and go into the kitchen. He didn't knock on the door either, he just walked in. For the longest time, I didn't hear a sound. I listened and listened. I must have stood still for 15 minutes. Then I heard someone playing our piano. I knew it must be Chink Johnson because this was not the kind of music anyone in our house would have been playing. I ran downstairs. My mother had been in the cellar, and she came up running out of the cellar, and my father came hurrying over from the drugstore. We all stood and looked and looked. Chink was sitting at our piano. He had a cigarette dangling from his lower lip, and the smoke from the cigarette was like a cloud, a blue-gray, hazy kind of cloud around his face, his eyes, and his beard, so that you could only catch glimpses of them through the smoke. He was playing some kind of fast, discordant-sounding music, and he was slapping the floor with one of his long feet, and he was slapping the keys with his long fingers. Aunt Sophronia was leaning against the piano, looking down at him. He did not use music when he played, and he never once looked at the keyboard. He just kept looking right into Aunt Sophronia's eyes. I thought my father would tell Chink to go slap somebody else's floor with his long feet, but my mother gave him one of those, now don't just say a word, looks, and he glared at Chink and went back to the drugstore. Chink stayed a long time. He played the piano, he sang, or rather, I guess you would say he talked to the music. It is a very peculiar kind of musical performance. He plays some chords, a whole series of them, and he makes peculiar changes in the chords as he plays. And then he says the words of a song. He doesn't really sing, but his voice does change in pitch too. In a sense, making the chords he is playing, and he does talk to a kind of rhythm which also matches the chords. See, I sat down beside him and watched what he was doing and listened to the words he chose. And though it is not exactly music as I'm accustomed to hearing it, I found it very interesting. He told me that what he does with those songs is known as the talking blues. Only he said talking, and he made blues sound like it was two separate words, not just a two-syllable word, but two distinct words. I have been trying to play the piano the way he does, but I get nothing but terrible sounds. I pretend that I'm blind and I keep my eyes closed all the time while I feel for chords. You must have a special gift for this because it is an extremely difficult thing to do that he is doing, and I don't know whether I will ever be able to do it. He has a much better ear for music than I have. Chink Johnson comes to see Aunt Sophronia almost every day. Sometimes when I look out in the backyard, Mr. Bennish is there too. He always sits on the ground, and at his age, I should think it might give him rheumatism. He must be a very brave little man, or else his love for Aunt Sophronia has given him great courage. I say this because Chink Johnson is very rude to Mr. Bennish, and he stares at him with a dreadfully cruel look on his face. If I were small and slender like an old Mr. Bennish, I would not sit in the same yard with a much bigger, much younger man who obviously did not want me there. I have thought a great deal about Mr. Bennish. I like him. He is truly a friend, but I do not think he should be interested in Aunt Sophronia, at least not in a loving kind of way. The thing that bothers me is that I honestly cannot decide whether I object to him as a suitor for her because he is white or because he is old. Sometimes I think it is for both reasons. I'm fairly certain it isn't just because he's old. This bothers me. If my objections to him are because he is white, and that's what I told him, but I often say things that I know people do not want me to hear, and that they particularly do not want to hear from someone very much younger than they are. Yeah, then I have been trained on the subject of race just as I have been trained to be a Christian. I know how I was trained to be a Christian, Sunday school, prayers, etc. I do not know exactly how I have been trained on the subject of race. Then, yes, why do I feel like this about Mr. Bennish? Shortly after I wrote that, I stopped puzzling about Mr. Bennish because summer officially started, at least for me. It is true that school has been out for a long time and we are wearing our summer clothes, and the yard is filled with flowers, but summer never really gets underway for me until Donald Smith comes for his yearly visit. Donald and Uncle Jono went to school together. They look sort of alike. They are big men and they are so light in color they look like white men. But something in them, Dotto says that it is a cultivated and developed and carefully nourished hatred of white men, will not permit them to pass for white. Dotto teaches English and elocution and dramatics at a school for black people in Georgia, and he gives lectures and readings during the summer to augment his income. Uncle Jono is the chief fundraising agent for a black school in Louisiana. I believe that my attitude towards Mr. Beamish stems from Donald Smith and Jono. They are both what my father calls race conscious. When they travel on trains in the South, they ride in Jim Crow coaches until the conductor threatens to have them arrested unless they sit in the sections of the train reserved for whites. They are always being put out of the black sections of waiting rooms and warned out of the black sections of town. and being refused lodgings in black rooming houses on the grounds that they would be a source of embarrassment. Nobody would be able to figure out why a white man wanted to live with black people, and they would be suspected of being spies. But of what kind or to what purpose they had never been able to determine. I have just reread what I have written here, and I find that I've left out the reason why I am writing so much about Donald. Yesterday afternoon, when I came back from an errand, there was a large, heavy looking bag, leather, but it was shaped like a carpet bag, near the bench where the customers sit when they wait for prescriptions. I recognized it immediately. I have seen that bag every summer for as far back as I can remember. I wondered if Doddle had come along this time or if he had a friend with him. Sometimes he brings a young man with him. These young men look very much alike. They are always slender, rather shy, have big dark eyes, and very smooth skin, just about the color of bamboo. I looked at Doddle's big, battered old bag sitting on the floor near the bench, and I could almost see him with his long, curly hair, and I could hear him reciting poetry in his rich, buttery voice. He can quote all the great speeches from Hamlet, Macbeth, Richard II, and he can recite the sonnets. I loved him. He was lively and funny and unexpected. Sometimes he would grab my braid and shout in his best Shakespearean voice, "Seize on her furies, take her to your torments." I looked at Doddle's battered bag and I said to my father, "Is he alone or has he got one of those pretty boys with him?" My father looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Alone." "How come he to leave his bag here then?" "Well, the Eagles aren't home. Ellen's gone on vacation." "Why does Aunt Ellen always go on vacation when Doddle comes?" My father ignored this and went on talking. "Johnno's gone to Albany collecting money for the school." "Where is Doddle now?" "I'm right here, sugar." And Donald Smith opened the screen door and came in. He looked bigger than he had the summer before. He hugged me. He smelled faintly of lavender. "You went and grew, honey," he said, and took off his hat and bowed. It was a wide-brimmed Panama, and he had on a starched white shirt and a flowing bronic kind of black tie. And I looked at him with absolute delight. He was being a Southern Colonel, and he was such an actor. I thought I could see lace at his wrists, hear mockingbirds sing, see a white-collar mansion, hear hoofbeats in the distance, and hear a long line of slaves suitably clad as footmen and coachmen and butlers and housemen murmur, "Yes, massa. Yes, massa." It was all there in his voice. "Why, in a couple of years I'll be reciting poetry to you. How's your mama? This summer I'll have to teach you how to talk. These Yanker teachers you've got all talk through their noses. They got you doing the same thing." For 2 whole days I forgot about Chink Johnson and Mr. Bennish and Aunt Sophronia. Doddle liked to go fishing and crabbing. He liked to play whist, and he could tell me the most marvelous stories and act them out. The very next day, Doddle and Uncle Johnno and I went crabbing. We set out early in the morning with our nets and our fishing lines and the rotten meat we used for bait, and our lunch and thermal bottles with lemonade in them. It was a 2-mile walk from where we lived to the creek where we caught crabs. There was a bridge across the creek, an old wooden bridge. Some of the planks were missing. We stood on this bridge or sat on it and threw our lines in the water. Once in a great while, a horse and wagon would drive across and set the planks to vibrating. Jono and Dottle would hop off the bridge, but I stayed on and held to the railing. The bridge trembled under my feet, and the horse and wagon would thunder across. And the driver usually waved and hollered, "I gotta go faster, we'll all fall in." The water in the creek was so clear I could see big crabs lurking way down on the bottom. I could see little pieces of white shells and beautiful stones. We didn't talk much while we were crabbing. Sometimes I lay flat on my stomach on the bridge and looked down into the water, watching the little eddies and whirlpools that formed after I threw in my line. Before we ate our lunch, we went wading in the creek. Jono and Dottle rolled up the legs of their pants, and their legs were so white I wondered if they were that white all over, and if they were, how they could be called black. We sat on the bank of the creek and ate our lunch. Afterward, Dottle and Jono told stories, wonderful stories in which animals talk, and there are haunted houses and ghosts and demons and old black preachers who believe in heaven and hell. They always started off the same way. Dottle would say to Jono, "Mr. Bones, be seated." Though I have heard some of those stories many, many times, Dottle and Jono never tell them exactly the same. They change their gestures. They vary their facial expressions and the pitch of their voices. Dottle almost always tells the story about the black man who goes in a store in a small town in the South and asks for Muriel cigars. The white man who owns the store says, and here Jono becomes an outraged southern white man, "Nigga, what's the matter with you? Don't you see that picture of that beautiful white woman on the front of this box? When you ask for them cigars, you say Miss Muriel cigars." Though Uncle Jono is a good storyteller, he is not as good, not as funny or as dramatic as Dottle. When I listen to Dottle, I can see the old black preacher who spent the night in a haunted house. I see him approaching the house, the wind blowing his coattails, and finally him taking refuge inside because of the violence of the storm. He lights a fire in the fireplace and sits down by it and rubs his hands together, warming them. As he sits there, he hears heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, and Dottle makes his hands go thump, thump, thump on the bank of the creek. And the biggest cat the old man has ever seen comes in and sits down, looks at the old preacher, looks around and says, "Has Martin got here yet?" The old man is too startled and too nervous to answer. He hears heavy footsteps again, thump, thump, thump. And a second cat, much bigger than the first one, comes in and sits down right next to the old preacher. Both cats stare at him. And then the second cat says to the first cat, "Has Martin got here yet?" And the first cat shakes his head. There is something so speculative in their glances and glance that the old man gets more and more uneasy. He wonders if they are deciding to eat him. The wind blows in the chimney, puffs of smoke blow back into the room. Then another and a bigger cat thumps down the stairs. Finally, there are 6 enormous cats, 3 on each side of him. Each one of these cats has asked the same questions of the other. "Martin got here yet?" A stair-shaking thread begins at the top of the stairs. The cats all look at each other, and the old man grabs his hat and says to the assembled cats, "You tell Martin I've been here, but I've gone." I clapped when Dottle finished the story. I looked around thinking how glad I am he is here, and what a wonderful place this is to listen to stories. The sun is warm, but there is a breeze, and it blows through the long marsh grass which borders the creek. The grass moves, seems to wave. Gulls fly high overhead. The only sound is the occasional cry of a gull and the lapping of water against the piling of the bridge. Jono tells the next story. It is about an old black preacher and a rabbit. The old man tries to outrun an over-friendly and very talkative rabbit. The rabbit keeps increasing in size. The old man runs away from him, and the rabbit catches up with him. Each time the rabbit says, "That was some run we had, wasn't it, brother?" Finally, the old man runs until he feels as though his lungs are going to burst and his legs will turn into rubber. And he looks back and doesn't see the rabbit anywhere in sight. He sits down on a stone to rest and catch his breath. He has just seated himself when he discovers the rabbit sitting right beside him smiling. The rabbit is now the same size as the preacher. The rabbit rolls his eyes and lisps, "That's what some runs we had there, wasn't it?" The old man stood up and got ready to run again and said, "Yeah, that was some runs we had, brother, but..." He took a deep breath. You ain't seen no running yet." After they finished telling stories, we all took naps. Dotto and Jono were wearing old straw hats, wide-brimmed Panamas with crooked, floppy brims. Dotto had attached a piece of mosquito netting to his hat, and it hung down across his shoulders from the back where he looked like a woman who was wearing a veil. When we woke up, it was late in the afternoon and time to start for home. I ran part of the way, and then I sat down by the side of the road in the shade and waited until they caught up with me. Dotto said, "Sugar, what are you in such a hurry for?" I said, laughing. "Mrs. Muriel, you tell me Martin, I've been here, but I've gone, and that he ain't seen no running yet." I got home first. Chink Johnson was in the store. When Dottle and Jono arrived, I introduced Chink to my uncles, Jono and Dottle. They didn't seem much impressed with each other. Jono nodded and Dottle smiled and left. Chink watched Dottle as he went toward the back room. Dottle has a very fat bottom and he sort of sways from side to side as he walks. Chink said, "He seems kind of ladylike. He related on your mother's side." "He's not related at all. He's an old friend of Uncle Jono's. They went to school together in Atlanta, Georgia." I sounded very condescending. "Do you know where that is?" "Yeah." "Nigga, read this. Nigga, don't let sundown catch you here. Nigga, if you can't read this, run away. If you can't run, then vanish. Just vanish out. Yeah, I know the place. I came from there." My father was standing outside on the walk, talking to Aunt Frank, so I felt at liberty to speak freely, and I said, "Nigga, what are you talking about? You want Muriel cigars. You see this picture of this beautiful red-headed white woman, nigga? You say, Miss Muriel." Chink stood up, and he was frowning, and his voice was harsh. "Little girl, don't you talk that way. I talk that way. If I feel like it, but don't you ever talk that way." I felt as though I had betrayed and been betrayed. At one moment, he was my friend, and we were speaking as equals, and the next moment, without warning, he is an adult who is scolding me in a loud, harsh voice. I was furious, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. This made me angrier. I couldn't seem to control my weeping recently, and I do not know how it happened. Whenever I am furiously angry, I begin to cry. Chink leaned over and put his hand under my chin, lifted my face, saw the tears, and he kissed my cheek. His beard was rough and scratchy. He smelled like pine woods, and I could see pine needles in his hair and in his beard, and I wondered if he and Aunt Sophronia had been in the woods. Sugar, he said gently, I don't like that Miss Muriel story. It ought to be told the other way around. A black man should be telling a white woman, white man, you see this picture of this beautiful black woman? White man, you say Miss Muriel. He went out of the store through the back room into the yard just as though he were a member of the family. It hadn't taken him very long to reach this position. Almost every afternoon he goes for a walk with Aunt Sophronia. I watch them when they leave the store. He walks so close to her that he seems to surround her, and he has his head bent so that his face is close to hers. Once I met them strolling up Petticoat Lane, his dark face so close to hers that his goat's beard was touching her smooth brown cheek. My mother used to watch them too, as they walked side by side on the dirt path that led to the woods. Miles and miles of woods. Sometimes he must have said things that Aunt Sophronia didn't like, because she would turn her head sharply away from him. I decided that once she got used to his beard and the peculiar color and slant of his eyes, why, you could say he had an interesting face. I don't know what it was about his eyes that makes me think of heat, but I know what color they are. They are the color of petrified wood after it's been polished. It's a red-brown, and that's what his eyes are like. I like the way he plays the piano, though I do not like his voice. I cannot get my mother to talk about him. My father grunts when I mention Chink's name and scowls so ferociously that it is obvious that he doesn't like him. I tried to find out what Aunt Sophronia thought of him. Later in the day, I found her in the store alone, and I said, Do you like Chink Johnson? She said, Run along and do the supper dishes. But do you? Don't ask personal questions, she said, and her face and neck flushed. She must have liked him, though. She not only went walking with him in the afternoon, but on Sunday mornings he went to church with her. He wore a white linen suit and that same stiff straw hat way back on his head. He brought her presents, a tall bottle of violet eau de cologne, a bunch of Parma violets made of silk, but they looked real. On Sundays, Aunt Sophronia wore the violets pinned at her waist, and they made her look elegant, like a picture in a book. I said, Oh, you look beautiful. My mother said dryly, Very stylish. We are all, we all crossed the street together on Sunday mornings. They went to church. I went to Sunday school. Sunday school was out first, and I waited for them to come down the church steps. Aunt Sophronia came down the church steps, and he would be so close behind her that he might have been dancing with her and matching his leg movements to hers. Suddenly he was in front of her and down on the path before she was, and he turned and held out his hand. Even there on the sidewalk, he wasn't standing still. It is as though his feet and his hands are more closely connected to his heart, to his central nervous system, than is true of other people, so that during every waking moment he moves, tapping his foot on the floor, tapping his fingers on a railing, on somebody's arm, on a tabletop. I wondered if he kept moving like that when he was asleep, tapping quarter notes with his foot, playing eighth notes with his right hand, half notes with his left hand. He attacked a piano when he played, violated it. Violate a piano? I thought, violate Aunt Sophronia? He stood on the dirt path and held out his hand to Aunt Sophronia, smiling, helping her down the church steps. "Get your prayers said, sugar," he said to me. "Yes, I said one for you and one for the family, Aunt Sophronia. You smell delicious, like violets." "She does, doesn't she?" We walked across the street to the drugstore, hand in hand. Chink was in the middle, and he held one of my hands and one of Aunt Sophronia's. He stays for dinner on Sundays, and on Sunday nights we close the store early and we all sit in the backyard where it is cool. Mr. Bennish joins us in the yard. At dusk, the fireflies come out, and then, as the darkness deepens, bats swoop around us. Aunt Sophronia says, "Ooh," and holds on to her head, afraid one might get entangled in her hair. Doddle took out one of his big white handkerchiefs and tied it around his head, and said in his richest, most buttery voice, "One of the nocturnal or crepuscular flying mammals constituting the order of courtship." Doddle sprawled in a chair and recited poetry or told long stories about the South, stories that sometimes had so much fear and terror and horror in them that we shivered even though the air was warm. Chink didn't spend the evening. He sat in one of the lawn chairs, tapping on the arm with his long, flexible fingers, and then left. Mr. Bennish always stays until we go in for the night. He takes no part in the conversation, but sits on the ground, huddled near Aunt Sophronia's skirts. Once, when a bat swooped quite close, Aunt Sophronia clutched his arm. Sometimes Doddle recites whole acts from Macbeth or Hamlet, or all of the Song of Solomon, or sometimes he recites the loveliest of Shakespeare's sonnets. We forget about the bats swooping over our heads, ignore the mosquitoes that sting our ankles and our legs, and sit mesmerized while he declaims, "Shall I comprehend thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" The summer is going faster and faster, perhaps because of the presence of Aunt Sophronia's suitors. I don't suppose Doddle is really a suitor, but he goes through the motions. He picks little bouquets for her, bachelor buttons and candy tuft, and leaves them on the kitchen table. He always calls her Miss Sophronia. If we are outdoors and he comes out to sit in the yard, he leaps to his feet and bows and says, "Wait, wait, before you sit on that bench, let me wipe it off." And he pulls out an enormous linen handkerchief and wipes off the bench. He is always bowing and kissing her hand. By the middle of August, it was very hot. My father had the store painted, and when the blinds were taken down, the painter found whole families of bats clinging together in back of blinds. Evidently there lived there. Evidently they lived there. I couldn't get hold of one, although I tried. They were the most peculiar-looking creatures. They looked almost like a person who wears glasses all the time and then suddenly goes without them. They have a kind of peering look. Chink Johnson is always in our house or in the store or in the yard or going for walks with Aunt Sophronia. Whenever he is not violating the piano at the inn, he is with Miss Aunt Sophronia. He taught her how to dance in the backyard without any music, just his counting and clapping his hands. His feet made no sound on our thick grass. One on one on two different sunny afternoons he gave her dancing lessons, and on the third afternoon he had her dancing. She was laughing and she was lively looking and she looked young. He persuaded her to take off her shoes and she danced in her bare feet. Fortunately, nobody knows this but me. He took her fishing. When they came back, she was quite sunburned, but her eyes were shining as though they held the reflected light from the sun shining on the water. Just in that one short summer, he seemed to take on all kinds of guises: fisherman, dancer, singer, church goer, even delivery boy. One morning, someone knocked at the back door, and there was Chink Johnson with our grocery order, saying to my Aunt Sophronia, "He is your meat, ma'am, and your vegetables," touching his hat, bowing, unloading the crate of groceries, and then sitting down at the kitchen table as though he owned it, drinking a cup of coffee that no one had offered him, just pouring it out of the enamel pot that stays on the stove, finding cream and sugar himself, and sitting there with his legs thrust way out in front of him, and those terribly tight pants he wears looking as though they were painted on his thighs. Sometimes when he sits in our kitchen, he laughs. His laughter is not merry. When my father laughs, the sound makes you laugh, even when you don't know what he's laughing about. When Chink Johnson laughs, I look away from him. The sound hurts my ears. It is like the ugly squawk of some big bird that you have disturbed in the woods, and it flies right into your face, pecking at your ears and eyes. It has been a very interesting summer. I have begun to refer to it in the past tense because there isn't much left of a summer by the middle of August. One Thursday afternoon, Aunt Sophronia and I saw that other ladies like Chink Johnson too. Thursday afternoon is traditionally maids' day off, and Chink Johnson drove the maids from the inn into town in a wagon late in the day. He stopped in front of the store with a wagon full of girls in long skirts, giggling, leaning against him, a kind of panting excitement in that wagon, their arms around him. They whispered to him. They were seized by fits of laughter, shrieks of laughter. They came in the store and brought hair nets and hairpins and shampoo and Vaseline and hair tonics and cough medicines and court plaster and a great many items that they did not need because it was a pleasure to be spending money and to be free of the tyranny of the housekeeper's demands. Or so my mother said, some young and attractive, some not so young, about 10 of them. Aunt Sophronia was in the store and she waited on them, studying them. Every once in a while, one would go to the door and yell, "We'll be out in a minute, Chink, just a little while," and wave at him and throw kisses at him. Then they were all gone, all at once, piling into the wagon, long, full skirts in disarray. One of them sat in Chink's lap, laughing, looking up into his face and saying, "Let's go into the woods, Chink. Take us in the woods. I'll help drive." Aunt Sophronia and I stood in a doorway and watched them as they drove off, going toward the pine woods. The wagon seemed to be filled with wide skirts and ruffled petticoats, all suddenly appended because Chink said, "Giddy up there," and hit the horse with the whip, cracked it over the horse's ear, and the horse started off as though he were a racehorse. It was late when they went past the store, going home. Sitting in the backyard, we could hear the horse racing and the girls squealing and laughing, and Chink singing a ribald song about strolling and strolling. Donald stopped right in the middle of a poem, and Mr. Bennish straightened up so that he was not quite so close to Aunt Sophronia's skirts. It was like having Chink Johnson right there in the backyard with us. The rough, atonal voice, the red-brown eyes that looked hot, literally hot, as though if you had touched them, you would have to withdraw your fingers immediately because they would be scorched or singed or burned. The juddering beard, the restless feet and hands. We sat absolutely still. We could hear the rattling of the wagon, the clop clop of the horse's hoofs, and above it, the laughter of the girls. And dominating that sound, Chink Johnson's voice lifted in song. Even after they were so far away we could not possibly hear them, these sounds seemed to linger in the air, faint, far off. It was a warm night, brilliant with light from the moon. I pictured the girls as sitting on top of Chink, all around him, on his arms, in his lap, on his shoulder, and I thought the prettiest one should be perched on his head. Doddle lit a cigar and puffed out clouds of bluish smoke and said, I never heard the mating call of the male so clearly sounded on a summer's night. He laughed so hard that he had to get out one of his big handkerchiefs and dab his eyes with it. Aunt Sophronia got up from the bed so fast that she brushed against Mr. Bennish, almost knocking him over. He lost his balance and regained it only because he supported himself with one hand on the ground. She must have known that she had very nearly upset him, but she went marching toward the house, her back very straight and her head up in the air, and she never once looked back. Doddle said, Have I offended her? My mother said, It's late. It's time we went in. Mr. Blemish must have gone home when we went in the house, but he was back in the yard so early the next morning he might just as well have spent the night. Doddle and I were standing in the kitchen looking down at the backyard. He was drinking coffee out of a mug, and I was eating a piece of bread and butter. Our backyard is a pretty sight on a summer's morning. It is filled with flowers, and birds are singing, and the air is very cool, and there is a special smell, a summer smell compounded of grass and dew on the grass and flowers, and the suggestion of heat to come later in the day. We looked out the door, and there was Mr. Bennish down on his knees in front of Aunt Sophronia. He was sitting on the bench, and she looked horrified, and she seemed to have been in the act of trying to stop him, one hand extended in a thrusting away motion. I thought, his pants legs will be very damp because there's still dew on the grass. And how did he get here so early? And did he know that she would be sitting on the bench almost before sunup? Ah, girlie, girlie, he said, on his knees in our backyard, kneeling on our thick, soft grass. Will you marry me? No. Is it, he said, because I am old? And his voice went straight up in pitch, just like a scale. I am not old. I am not old. Why, I can still jump in the air and click my heels together 3 times. And he did. He got up off his knees and he jumped up, straight up, and clicked his heels together 3 times and landed on the grass, and there was just a slight thumping sound when he landed. Aunt Sophronia said, Mr. Beamish, don't do that. Don't do that. Go away. Go home. And she ran toward the house, and he started after her. And then he saw us standing in the door, watching him, and he stood still. He shouted after her, "I'll put on my best coat and my best hat, and you won't know me. I'll be back, and you won't know me." Dotto glared at him through the screen door and said, "You old fool, you old fool." Mr. Bennish hurried around the side of the house, pretending that he hadn't heard him. I did not know when Mr. Bennish would be back, wearing his best coat and his best hat, but I certainly wanted to see him and, if possible, to witness his next performance. I decided that whenever Aunt Sophronia was in the store, I'd be in the store too. When my father went to eat his dinner at 12:30, Aunt Sophronia looked after the store. There were not many people who came in at that hour. It was the dinner hour, and Aunt Sophronia sat in the prescription room with the door open and read the morning newspaper. There was an old wooden chair by the window in the prescription room. It had a faded painting across the back, a wooden seat, and back and arms. It was a very comfortable chair if you sat up straight, and Aunt Sophronia sat up very straight. She could look out of the window and see the church green, see the path that went up Petticoat Lane toward the pine woods, and she commanded a view of the interior of the store. I don't think she saw Mr. Bennish when he entered. If she had, she would have gotten out of the chair immediately to wait on him. But she was reading the newspaper, and he came in very quietly. He was wearing a cutaway coat that was too long, and a pair of striped trousers, and he was carrying a silk hat in his hand, a collapsed silk hat. He stopped inside the door and put the hat in shape, and then placed it carefully on his head. He looked like a circus clown who is making fun of the ringmaster, mocking him, making his costume look silly. Mr. Bennish went straight through the store and stood in front of Aunt Sophronia, and he jumped straight up in the air like a dancer and clicked his heels together 3 times. The bottles on the shelves rattled, and the back room was filled with a pinging sound. "Oh, my goodness," Aunt Sophronia said, frowning. "Oh, my goodness, don't jump like that." And she stood up. My father came in through the back door, and he said, "What's going on in here? What's going on in here?" Mr. Bennish said, "I was just showing Miss Sophronia that I can still jump up in the air and click my heels together 3 times before I come back down again." My father made a noise that sounded like "bah," but wasn't quite, and Mr. Bennish retreated, talking very fast. "I had asked Miss Sophronia if she would marry me, and she said no, and I thought perhaps it was because she thinks I'm too old and not stylish enough. And so I got dressed up, and I was showing her I could still jump." "Get out of here. Get out of here. Get out of here." My father's voice kept rising and increasing in volume, and his face looked as though he were about to burst. It seemed to darken and to swell, to get bigger. Aunt Sophronia said, "Oh, you mustn't talk to him like that." My father was moving toward Mr. Bennish, and Mr. Bennish was retreating, and finally he turned and ran out of the store and ran up Petticoat Lane with his long coattails flapping about his legs. My father said, "I shouldn't have let him hang around here all these months. I can't leave this store for 5 minutes that I don't find one of those no good hanging around. No, they're just hanging around when I come back. Now, one of them worth the powder and a shot to blow him to hell and back. That piano player pawing in the ground with his old white man jumping up in the air. And that friend of Jono, that poet or wherever he is, all he needs are some starched petticoats and a bonnet, and he'd be a woman. He's practically one now, and he's teeing around. And if they were all putting together in one piece, it still wouldn't be a whole man. My father shook his fist in the air and glared at Aunt Sophronia. I guess it's all my fault. Aunt Sophronia sounded choked up and funny. My father said, no, I didn't mean that, and patted her arm. It's all perfectly natural. It's just that we're the only black people living in this little bit of town, see, and there aren't any fine young black men around. Only this tramp piano player, and every time I look at him, I can hear him playing some rags and see a whole line of the big bosom women done up in sequin dresses standing over him, moaning about and wanting somebody to turn their dampers down. And I can see poker games and crap games. And my mother came in through the back room. She said, Samuel, why are you talking about gambling games? I was trying to explain to Sophie how I feel about that piano player. To my surprise, my mother said, has Sophronia asked you how you feel about Mr. Johnson? When my father shook his head, she said, then I don't think there is any reason for you to say anything about him. I need you in the garden. I want you to move one of my peonies. I wonder what my mother would say if she knew how my father chased little Mr. Bennish out of the store. I wonder if Mr. Bennish will ever come back. Mr. Bennish did come back. He came back the following Sunday. We were all in the store, Aunt Sophronia and Dotto and Chink and I. Mr. Bennish sidled in through the door. He looked as though he expected someone to jump out at him and yell, go home. But he came in anyway, and he sat down beside me on the bench near the front of the store. Chink was leaning on the cigar case, talking to Aunt Sophronia, his face very close to hers. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he seemed to be trying to persuade her to do something, to go for a walk or something, and she was obviously refusing, politely but definitely. Dotto was standing near the back of the store watching Chink. Aunt Frank opened the store door, and she stood in the doorway holding the screen door open. She has a cross, sharp way of speaking, very fast and very pleasant. She saw me and she said, where's Martha? I wasn't expecting to see Aunt Frank in the store at that hour, and I was so surprised that I didn't answer her. What's the matter with you? Cat and got your tongue? Didn't you hear what I said? Where's your mother? She's over on the other side of the building, in the kitchen. She's having coffee with my father. She scowled at Chink. How's that bearded man been in here talking to Sophie? Chink turned around and looked toward Aunt Frank. Aunt Sophronia started toward her, moving very fast out from behind the cigar case, saying, can I get something for you? As Aunt Frank stood there holding the door open, a whole flight of bats came in the store. I say a flight because I don't know what else to call a large-sized group of bats. They swooped down and up in a blind, fast flight. Aunt Frank shrieked, ah! My hair! Watch out for your hair! Ah! And stood up on the bench and held her black, fusty skirts close about her and then pulled them over her head. I decided she had confused mice and bats, that the technique for getting rid of mice was to stand on a chair and clutch one's skirts around one, that is, if you were a lady and pretended to be afraid of mice. I did learn that Aunt Frank was wearing carpet slippers made of dark gray felt, black cotton stockings, and under the outside layer of skirts there seemed to be a great many layers of black petticoats. Dottle ran into the back room and held the door tightly shut. There is a glass in the door, and he could look out at the rest of us as we dodged the bats. I could see his large, pale face and long hair, and I suppose he was as frightened as Aunt Frank that bats would get entangled in his hair, because he squealed, all the rich, buttery quality gone from his voice, just a high-pitched squealing. Aunt Frank cautiously lowered the outer skirt, fumbled in a pocket, and took out a bottle. Not a big bottle, but about the size of an eighth-ounce cough medicine bottle, and she took 2 or 3 swigs from it, recorked it, and then recovered her head. Chink grabbed a newspaper and slapped at the bats as they circled. Gotcha! Ha! Hit gotcha! Ha! Gotcha! Ha! Ha! And he folded the newspaper and belted them as they swished past him. Mr. Bennish stared. I decided that he lived with bats and spiders and mice. Well, not lived with, perhaps, but was so accustomed to them that he could not understand why they should cause all this noise and confusion and fear. He ignored the bats entirely and went to the rescue of his lady love. He clasped Aunt Sophronia to his bosom, covering her head with his hands and arms, and he kept murmuring comforting words. Now, now, I won't let anything hurt you. Nothing can harm you. He took a deep breath and said quite distinctly, I love you, my darling. I love you. Love you. Aunt Sophronia seemed to nestle in his arms, to cuddle closer to him, to lean harder every time a bat swooped past them. Father came through the back room. He had to wrestle Dottle out of the way before he could get through the door, and he very sensibly held the screen door open, and what with the impetus offered by Chink's folded newspaper, the bat swooped outside. It was really very exciting while it lasted, what with all the shrieks and the swift movement of the bats. When I began to really look around, the first thing I noticed was that Aunt Sophronia was still huddled in the protective arms of Mr. Bennish. Dottle came out of the back room with his mouth pursed, and his cheeks were puffed out a little, and I wouldn't have been surprised if he had hissed at Mr. Bennish. He and Chink headed straight toward Mr. Bennish. They are very tall men, and Mr. Bennish is short and slender, and as they converged on him, one from the rear and the other from the side, he looked smaller and older than ever. Aunt Sophronia stepped away from Mr. Bennish. She moved toward Chink. One side of her face was red, where it had been pressed hard against the wool of Mr. Bennish's coat. All of a sudden, my father's hand was resting on one of Chink's shoulders. He was large, heavy hands, and his hand seemed to have descended suddenly and with great weight. He said, You'll not start any trouble in my stall. Aunt Frank said, Bats. Bats. She indicated that my father was to help her down from the bench. She climbed down awkwardly, holding on to him. Worse than bats, she said, and she made a wide, all-inclusive gesture that took in Chink and Doddle and Mr. Bennish. Where's Martha? She demanded. She's still in the kitchen? My father nodded. He held the door open for Mr. Bennish, and Mr. Bennish scuttled out. Doddle and Chink went out too. I found a dead bat on the floor and sat down on the bench on the front of the store to examine it. It had a very unpleasant smell, but it was such an interesting creature that I ignored the odor. It had rather large, pointed ears that I thought were quite charming. It had very sharp little claws. I could see why the ladies had screamed and covered their heads, because if those claws got entangled in their long hair, someone would have had to cut their hair to get a bat out. Aunt Frank's hair isn't long. It is like a sheep's wool, tight curled and close to the skin or scalp. But I suppose a bat's sharp little claws and peculiar wings snarled up in that might create more of a problem than it would if caught in longer and less tightly curled hair. The wings of the bat were webbed like the feet of ducks, with a thin membrane-like tissue that was attached to the body, reaching from the front legs or arms to the back legs and attached to the wings and sides. The body was small in comparison to the wide sweep of those curious wings. I stretched its wings out, and they looked like the inside of an opened umbrella, and I couldn't help admiring them. I began to think of all the things I'd heard said about bats. Blind as a bat, and the word batty, meaning crazy, and I tried to figure out why batty. Probably because a bat's behavior didn't make sense to a human being. Its fast, erratic flight would look senseless. Then Aunt Frank's voice sounded right in my ear, and her horrible breath was in my nose, and she smelled worse than the bat. She said, "You throw that nasty thing away. You throw that nasty thing away." I thrust the dead bat straight at her black and wrinkled face. "Look out!" I yelled. "It'll suck your blood. It's still alive. Look out!" She jumped away, absolutely furious. "You little vixen," she said, and squealed just like a pig. Then she saw my mother standing in the door of the prescription room. "Martha," she commanded, "you come here and make her throw this nasty thing away. Make her throw it away. She's sitting here playing with a dead bat." My mother said, "If you want to look at the bat, take it outside or take it in the back room. You can't keep a dead bat here in the drugstore." "This can't hurt. It can't hurt her. It's dead," she interrupted me. "Many people are afraid of bats. It doesn't make a difference whether the bats are dead or alive. They are still afraid of them." I went outside and sat on the front steps and waited. There was a full moon, and the light from it made the street and the houses and the church look as though they had been whitewashed. I put the bat beside me on the step. I was going to wait for Aunt Frank, and when she came out of the store and started down the steps, I was going to put the dead, stinking bat in one of the big pockets in her skirt, the pocket where she kept her bottle of gin. And when she got home and reached for a drink, I hoped she would encounter, touch with her bony fingers the corpse of one of the nocturnal or crepuscular flying mammals constituting the order of Chiroptera. As a token of my affection, I must have waited there on the steps for 2 hours. My father began putting out the lights in the store. I stayed right there, anticipating the moment when my ancient enemy, Aunt Frank, who would come stumbling around the side of the building. And then, one moment I was sitting on the splintery front steps of the store, and the next moment I was running up Petticoat Lane, going just as fast as I could because it had suddenly occurred to me that Chink Johnson and Donald Smith had gone out of the drugstore right behind Mr. Bennish, and they hadn't returned. By the time I reached Mr. Bennish's shop, I was panting. I couldn't catch my breath. Mr. Bennish's wagon was drawn up close to the side of the shop. The horse was hitched to it. Mr. Bennish was loading the headboard of his beautiful brass bed on the wagon. He was obviously moving, leaving town, at night. He walked in a peculiar fashion as though he were lame. He was panting, too, and making hiccuping noises like someone who had been crying a long time. So long that no real sound comes out, just a kind of hiccuping noise due to the contractions of the throat muscles and leaving and heaving of the chest. As I stood there, he got the headboard on the wagon, and then he struggled with his mattress, and then the springs, and then he brought out his cobbler's bench. Doddle and Chink stood watching him, just like two guards or two sheriffs. None of us said anything. I finally sat down on the enormous millstone that served as Mr. Bennish's front step. I sat way off to one side where I wouldn't interfere with his comings and goings. Mayeline, his cat, rubbed against me and then came and sat in my lap with her back to me, facing toward Mr. Bennish. It didn't take him very long to empty the shop of his belongings. I couldn't help thinking that if we were ever moved, it would take us days to pack all the books and the pictures and the china and all our clothes and furniture. We all collected things. Aunt Sophronia did beautiful embroidery, and she collected embroidered fabrics, and Mother collected old dishes and old furniture, and my father collected old glass bottles and old mortars, and they all collected books. And then all the rooms had furniture, and there were all kinds of cooking pots. No one of us would ever get all of his belongings in one wagon. Mr. Bennish came out of the shop and walked all around the little building with that peculiar stiff-legged gait. Apparently, the only item he'd overlooked was his garden bench. He had trouble getting it in the wagon, and I dumped Mayeline on the ground and went to help him. One of Doddle's meaty hands gripped my braid. "He can manage." I twisted away from him. "He's just a little old man, and he's my friend, and I'm going to help him." Chink said, "Leave her alone." Doddle let go of my hair. I helped put the bench in the wagon, and then went inside the shop with him and helped him carry out the few items that were left. Each time I went inside the shop, Mr. Bennish asked him questions. We both whispered. "Where are you going, Mr. Bennish?" "Massachusetts." "Why?" He didn't answer. His hiccups got worse. I waited until we'd taken down the green summer curtains and carefully folded them and put them in the little trunk that held some of his clothes, and put his broom and his dustpan and his tall kitchen cooking stool on the wagon before I repeated my question. His hiccups had quieted down. "Why are you leaving, Mr. Bennish?" I whispered. "They were going to sew me up." "Sew you up, did you say? Sew you up?" "Yes." "Where?" I said, staring at him, thinking, sew up? Sew up what? Eyes, nostrils, mouth, ears, rectum? "They were trying to scare you, Mr. Bennish. Nobody would sew up a person, a human being, unless it was a surgeon after an operation." He shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I thought so too, but no, they meant it with my own wax thread." "Did they?" "Hush, hush." We used this little piece of flowered carpet to wrap his wash bowl and pitcher in, and then put the whole bulky package it made on the wagon. We went back inside to make sure that we hadn't forgotten anything. The inside of his shop looked very small and shabby and lonely. There wasn't anything left except his stove, and he obviously couldn't take that. It was a very big, handsome stove, and he kept it quite shiny and clean. "Can you keep a secret?" he whispered, standing quite close to me. He smelled old and dusty and withered like dried flowers. I nodded. He handed me a small velvet bag. "Hide it, girlie," he whispered. "It's some old jewelry that belonged to my mother. Give it to Miss Sophronia at Christmas from me." He patted my arm. We went outside and he took down the sign with the lady's high-laced shoe painted on it and put it on the wagon seat. He climbed in the wagon, picked up the reins. "Mayoline! Mayoline!" he called. It was the most musical sound I had ever heard used to call a cat. She answered him instantly. She meowed and jumped up on the wagon seat beside him. He clucked to the horse and they were off. I waited not only until they were out of sight, but until I could no longer hear the creak of the wagon wheels and the clap-clap of the horse's hoofs. And then I turned and ran. Chink said, "Wait a minute." Dotto said, "You don't understand." I stopped running just long enough to shout at them, "You both stink. You stink like dead bats. You and your goddamn Miss Muriel."